President Trump says that the Iranians are in a state of collapse. The chairman, the person who's in charge of energy, the energy secretary for President Trump, says that everything is in hand and there's no problem and we're in a great position. But are we? Is that the case? Because there is growing evidence that we are not just not okay, but we are on the edge of an outright energy crisis and all the things that go along with that because of the continued closure of the Strait of Hormuz with these dueling blockades, which is wreaking havoc on global markets around the world. We're going to talk about how serious is this and how quickly can it get unwound if a political decision is made, and then, God help us, if a military decision is taken to try and really force it one more time open, what the consequences of that could be. And we are very grateful to have back with us today Commodore Steve Jermy, retired from the UK, combat veteran in naval warfare, and now an energy expert. So we're doubly grateful to have you back on. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Yeah, good to be back, Danny. As I say, it was a second career. I'm just 15 years in now to a career in offshore energy. So
just 15 years in. Well, that's a lot of people have about 15 minutes of information right now, so you're way ahead of most of us. But listen, there's a lot of things to discuss today, and really both of your worlds of expertise. And I want to jump right into it. First of all, this is Alex Reportedly, Media, who says, hey, listen, we are on the verge of an outright crisis.
This oil shock is going to run vibrations right through this planet, and we are in serious trouble here in the next 30 to 60 days. It doesn't matter if they open it up tomorrow morning. We have catastrophe on our hands here. And let's go to helium. If you start to hear people canceling MRIs and stuff like that, well, helium is a component that is used in that. I was talking to a doctor in the United States about the use of helium. Look at the price. This is all connected. In the next 30 to 60 days, watch the price of oil. They can't hold it down. They're trying to hold it down at the market here, giving these illusion prices of paper. These are paper trades in the derivatives market. And if anybody knows the derivatives market like me, they will totally understand that this is an absolute con job.
So, I mean, let's take a look at that, because for a while, President Trump has been able to keep the price of oil around $100 a barrel, maybe a little bit under it, with a lot of market manipulations and statements about this or that deal being done. But you see right now, this is a live ticker. That's at 110 for Brent right now. And according to many experts, and this apparently is one of them, that's going to be not the ceiling, but possibly even not the floor either. We could be going higher. What do you think?
Yeah, I'd be surprised if not, Danny. The president may have been able to keep the price down, but it just can't go on. You know, it's like trying to keep a bubble from bursting through to the center. The fact is that if you take somewhere between 20 and 13 million barrels a day out of the oil sector, which is very sort of reactive sector, it's bound to have an effect. I mean, you simply can't suppress it. You can suppress it for a bit through the trading mechanisms, but ultimately it has to show. And when it shows, it's going to be pretty difficult, I'm afraid to say. And it is already starting to show, Danny. And I think what we're starting to see is some of the effects. But I've always felt, as I start to think about this would act a bit like a tsunami. So the waves would spread out from where the initial impact was, spread out in time, if you like, and that they would eventually start to manifest themselves in different ways. And so I think he's exactly right. I think the Director General of the IEA said only recently that the consequence of the oil shock would be the same as the first and the second oil shocks of 73 and 79 and COVID put together. And I'm not sure it'll be quite that figure. But you can't just take this massive amount of oil and, of course, LNG out of the global system for it not to have an effect. I'm starting to see, I did some modeling on this when we last talked, still to update that, because I'm starting to see some interesting analysis and how things are starting to shape slightly differently. But the big question for me is just quite how much oil has been taken out. And I think what we're starting to see, I think I've seen it might have been Goldman Sachs or one of the big multinationals, one of the big investment banks, saying that actually the current level of oil is down to it's 13 million barrels per day as opposed to 20. But whatever the case, it's huge. And when you relate that as well to the close relationship between oil in particular and energy in general and GDP, this will show up in a recession. And it will show up in a recession of the same order of magnitude as the amount of oil that you take percentage-wise out of the system. So the global economy is looking at a reduction, if nothing happens, of GDP in the order of in excess of 10%, which, again, if nothing happens, is the sort of order that you would equate to a depression. Roughly speaking, a severe recession is about 5% of GDP, and a depression is about 10% of GDP. So yeah, we are looking at this huge shock, and it's one of the interesting things is that even if the straits were to be open now, this very minute, that the effects would ripple on into the months and years ahead of us. So this is coming.
And in fact, nothing has cleared the. In fact, DD Geopolitics had a reporter on site in the Strait of Hormuz, and this is what he's reporting.
In terms of ship traffic, we're not seeing much at all. We're seeing very little movement. Most of the tankers and large vessels out here, whether they are carrying petrochemicals or cargo, most of them are not moving. Most of them are stable, and most of them are anchored. There has been no sign of any military activity.
Now, so nothing is going on, but it's just this tense. One of our guests this morning said it's kind of like hearkening back to the Sitzkrieg of the World War II, after Poland was taken by the Nazi Germans and before France was intact in May 1940. And people were like, is there really a war? Is there not? Because they couldn't see anything. And it seemed like something like that. He thinks it's in that realm there. But then, because right now, no one's firing at anybody, but the dueling blockades are still in place. Now, you mentioned about the amount of oil going out. There's nothing going out through the Strait of Hormuz, but that's not the only way oil can get out. So the question is, what is the net loss? And this analysis here, I thought was pretty good that it shows in the shut-in amount, the amount that's not getting out. And you see here in the pre-war, Saudi Arabia had 10.4, UAE 3.55 million barrels a day, et cetera, for a total of 20.98 million barrels. And then you had post-war, you have rerouting. The Saudi east to west has about 7 million barrels a day, but export capacity at Yanbu is only 4 million barrels a day, so domestic needs. So Saudi shut-in is about 3.5 to 4 million barrels UAE, and you see the rest of them right down there, for a total shut-in of 11.3 to 11.8 million barrels a day. That is what is being deprived from the global market, which is 10 or 11% of the demand that's daily right now. Now, a lot of that demand, and I wonder if you could talk about why there's a lot of concern of this, and why this right here has worked by President Trump, where he had a lot of statements that were made over this period. You can see talked about there April 13 to 27, where he made a number of statements that had a mitigating effect on the price of oil, and it went down each time and kept it from going up too high. But there's the problem with this lack of oil getting out is that there has been more oil put on the system through the release of strategic petroleum reserves, so it's mitigating against that. So the oil market itself said, well, it seems like there's still enough to meet some supply and demand are still working out, but now that those SPRs are starting to run low, what happens when you don't have any more SPR to give out and you still have 11 or 12 million barrels a day not getting out of the Gulf?
Well, the first thing is the SPR is actually reduced slowly. So that figure of 11 or around about 11, Danny, sounds about similar to the figure of 13 that I was looking at. Because from memory, I think the SPRs are actually being drawn at around about 2 million barrels per day. So that's that mitigation. But the plain fact is that when you get to the moment where actually there is nothing and there is no more than, and so you're at 13% and then 11% or whatever, then you're talking about not a question of the issue is sorted not by price but by availability, and so people will simply be without oil. I mean, I have heard figures like, and they're all rather secondhand, but figures like Pakistan have been prepared to pay $200 a barrel to get oil, and of course all of those countries in the Far East are particularly dependent on the oil from the Gulf. But the fundamental thing, Danny, is that oil is the critical energy supply of all the energy supplies, because it generally backs up all the others. So oil and the the key products that come from oil, aviation fuel, but particularly diesel. And I keep going on about diesel, but it is so important. Are critical to the running of all the other energy sectors. You can't build a nuclear power station without diesel-powered JCBs. You can't run an offshore wind farm without diesel-powered service operations vessels and crew transfer vessels. You can't farm without diesel. You can't send ships off to sea to catch fish without diesel. It is the critical thing. So it's if you're taking this amount of oil out of the system, the only way to solve the balance is for demand reduction, which means that you're doing less and less. And that demand reduction will come initially, I would think, across those places where the use of the fuel is discretionary, and that's travel. So travel for retail travel for people who want to go on holiday, or people who want to drive their diesel cars around, or those sorts of things. At least I would hope that that's the way that governments would think about it. The danger in places like this country, for example, is that people look at food and think, well, it's a very small proportion of the GDP. I think farming is about 3% of the GDP, and fishing is about the same. And so the treasuries and the financial staffs aren't really that worried about it. They think that if you can't get these industries working, that's fine. We'll just import it from abroad. But you can't import it from abroad if it's not there. So the danger is that actually what they'll do is that they won't privilege food and energy as the key areas. And so it runs just about everything. I've been a rather lonely voice in my country talking about diesel, but it is critical. And now, whenever I drive around anywhere in the country, I look across and I see a JCB doing some construction work. I see a large farm, a large tractor, which is 3 times the size of the tractors that I used to drive when I was a boy. I look out to sea, and there's a beam trawler with a 600 brake horsepower engine powered by diesel. There's almost nothing in the maritime world that isn't driven by diesel or similar fuels, bunker fuels. And bunker fuels, I think the figure that I've got in my mind for bunker fuels are now up by double and even triple. So all of a sudden, rushing your goods across the oceans is going to make much less sense. So we'll see things like, for example, big increases in transport costs. I mean, it's inevitable. I mean, aviation costs are up. I think Lufthansa have cut. The figure I've got in mind is 20,000 flights because of anticipated aviation fuel shortages. But much more important, really, for the global economy is maritime costs. So if maritime costs are going up, then we're bound to see a reduction in maritime trade. I think one of the things I've always said was that when people talked about globalization as an inevitability somehow, a structural inevitability to the world, I always thought to myself, and would often say, it's not an inevitability. Globalization is simply a function of the fact that we've got cheap diesel and cheap aviation fuel, and we can fly stuff around the world. And I really feel for those companies that thought this way, and then thought it'd be a really good idea to offshore all their industries to places where it was cheaper. I mean, now, for example, if you're working out of this country or out of the United States, I guess, and all of your industry is based on offshored companies or offshore work in Vietnam or in places like that, or China, suddenly it's going to cost you a lot more to get your kit back across the ocean to sell it here. So you can see this interrelationship. This is why that offshore, that energy is the critical issue, and the other people who don't understand it turning on defence. Defence are really poor in understanding it, with the exception of one or two honourable exceptions. I would say the US Navy is pretty good, but my Navy, I don't think they've got a clue. Whenever we were talking to people to Ministry of Defence about energy, they assumed that I was talking about climate change. That we've got to keep energy consumption down because of CO2 emissions, but I wasn't talking about that at all. I was talking about availability. You drive very far in a diesel powered frigate at 1 cubic meter an hour, if you haven't got any. So, and it'll be the same with jets. High performance jets are big users of energy, and so too, as you all know from your background, so too are tanks. I mean, I think I remember. I think this conversation you and I have had some time before was that to get a litre or a gallon of diesel to the front line in Afghanistan took 400 litres of logistic support to get it there. And those mathematics no longer make sense. So, the countries who are going to come out of this okay are those which are net energy exporters and energy independent. The most obvious one being Russia, and the one that will probably do okay is China, because it's made sure that it's got very big reserves. But
I want to ask you, go into a question you said a second ago, because I think it's something that's not generally understood, and I think is absolutely critical at this particular moment. And that is the general truism that there is a direct correlation between the amount and availability of cheap petroleum products and GDP creation. And that if you take whatever the barrel of oil seems to be the marker, and if you take that amount out, not because of market forces, but because of political situations like now or war, and you take that out, that GDP can't stay where it was. It's going to have to come into balance with it. Can you explain how that works?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's very simple, Danny. I mean, the way that the way to think about it is to think about how we use energy, and energy is a critical factor. Now, what you will tend to see is GDP, a big contribution of GDP is the financial sector. Next down is probably industry, and down at the bottom, if you can imagine an inverted triangle, is energy. But when you look at energy use, it's much higher in the industries that are the base industries, such as food and energy, and also in basic industries. I mean, basic industries, manufacturing, uses huge amounts of energy. But this is a correlation which has been shown to be consistent over time. And as a former mathematician, when you hear a correlation which is close to 1, which is what it is, then that means that there is a very close relationship. Now, some people will argue that relationship is the causality of that relationship is that actually the more the economy grows, then the more we need energy. But I think it's the other way around, and I would challenge people who say that. I think it's the other way around, which is that the more energy we have, the more we are able to do economically, and the less energy we have, then the less we're able to do economically. And GDP is not a good metric, I'm afraid. It's based on money and as its metrics. So, for money, what have we got? We've got 160 or so different currencies which change over time and between regions. It's a terrible system for measuring anything. Whereas energy is the reverse. I mean, a barrel of oil is a barrel of oil is a barrel of oil. They all carry, roughly speaking, the same amount of energy density. So when you look at it through the energy lens, you see this correlation much, much more closely. And it is an inevitability, as far as I can see, that as soon as you start to reduce the core element of oil, then so too GDP will reduce. And that's the basis on which I made the forecast last time round, Danny. I'm just refining those models and should have them a little bit better next time round.
And so how does demand destruction factor into that? Because if you can make calculated decisions, whatever, that's one thing. If it's just not there, then I guess the market is going to cause demand destruction. Can you explain how demand destruction even works?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the simple ways of demand destruction is through price, Benny. So suddenly the barrel of oil that was 97 or sort of 77, a barrel of Brent, that was 77 dollars a barrel, is now up to $200 and $300 a barrel. Well, people just can't afford it. So that's the way that demand destruction works. So there's the other issue, though, of course, is availability. So if the oil and gas isn't there in a particular country, then that's a very catastrophic demand destruction.
So let me ask you, it's probably a hard question, and it's always one of the more difficult ones for anybody to assess, but just the best you can. There's a lot of talk that, hey, you know what, man, if especially if the U.S. goes in and says, oh, no, we're going to solve this militarily, and we go in with a big hit and hit the Iranian oil infrastructure, and then they retaliate and hit the GCC oil infrastructure. So now it's no longer a political block, but it's a physical constraint. God only knows how long it would take to get that back up even after the war was over. And they say this could immediately spike up to $200 and then maybe $250 a barrel, et cetera. But then I've heard from lots of experts that it may go up that far for a moment, but then it's going to come back down because there will be so much demand destruction. People won't be buying anything. So then the supply and demand come back into equilibrium at some point. Can you explain as best you can how that works and what you think would happen if we had an unexpected spike to 200?
Yeah, I mean, if there was an unexpected spike to 200 for those reasons, then I think we will get demand destruction. But of course, what you then get is that you then get because it's a world market, you then get historically high prices for a significant length of time, and what that will do is provide, if you like, another type of demand destruction, which is companies will go out of business, and when those companies go out of business, they won't quickly come back into business. So this is and that's not only demand destruction through the loss of those companies; it's the loss of the economic capability that those companies provide. So what you've got there is a fairly catastrophic thing. I think as well, of course, if you're going to try and bring that capacity back online, as the deep oil experts will know much better than me, it takes a long time to do energy infrastructure, both repair, particularly repair, but also the general development of energy infrastructure. We're talking about years and years as opposed to months. So there will be a recovery time as well. So for all those reasons, the demand destruction, I would be interested to see if it does come down. But whatever happens, the fact that demand destruction has happened means that the GDP has come down. So, if we had demand destruction of 20%, it means that GDP has come down. So it'll be interesting to see what level of price there might be. But we're talking about a world where we're in the middle of a Great Depression. I think I've mentioned before the Great Depression of the 29-30. We saw GDP destruction of about 15.9%. If we're talking something like 20%, we're talking about the same order of magnitude, if not slightly worse, than the Great Depression. And in the Great Depression, I think in the States and in this country, there were 20% people unemployed. And again, I think I mentioned before, the only thing that got us out of that, and this is a really, really significant point, it's subtle, but is the only thing that got us out of that was, in a way, was World War II. And in a way, what happened was World War II, as we got going, and particularly in the United States, but also using other sources of oil. World War II is fought on oil, whereas World War I was fought on coal, with a few exceptions. The British were using oil-fired ships. But World War II was fought, largely speaking, on oil. So there's a huge ramp-up in the amount of oil that was used. And the key source was the United States. There were other sources of oil. The Russians had their own oil, and the British were securing oil from the Gulf and from what was then Persia. So what that allowed us to do is recover GDP, because, of course, by burning all that extra oil, we were actually, again, increasing the economic activity. But again, there won't be that extra oil available this time round, because we think, in fact, with a high degree of certainty, that we're already at a plateau of oil production. So it's very difficult to see where that extra production would come. So I think what we're talking about is not only a reduction in oil of about 20%, but a structural reduction in the size of the size of the world economy by 20%, which is bound to have effects which are they're millennial in time.
Let's take a look at that. Where might be, if the Middle East, especially if it suffers a catastrophic loss here and in the physical damage to its infrastructure, where might people be able to plus up? Because I think it was the IEA, International Energy Agency, just said their forecast is for the United States to actually decrease its production over the next year because of investments that haven't been made in the last few years. And you can't just flip that on. So it doesn't appear that the United States would be able to ramp up, at least not in any short time frame, oil. So what else does that leave? I mean, maybe Venezuela, maybe Russia. What else on the global market? North Sea. I don't know. Could anybody else meaningfully increase the amount of production outside of the Middle East?
I'm not sure there are any locations. I mean, the ones that spring to mind is Brazil, I've forgotten the name of the country just to the north of Brazil. One of the small three countries to the north of Brazil has offshore energy, so there is some offshore energy around. Another example is Argentina, which has had shale. But the idea, I think we had Trump saying that they could double American oil production. I mean, it's simply impossible. The Bakken field, which I think is the last of the big American shale plays, has not increased production significantly over the last year or so, I think. So all of those potential sources, it's difficult to see any silver bullet there. In fact, I can't see a silver bullet there. And the other thing as well is that when these potential sources are started, and as you say, it'll be a year or 2 years before after we turn the financial investment decision to actually bring the source online, which incidentally is the reason that shale is a good thing for speed, because shale moves much more quickly in coming online, but lasts for not nearly as long as a conventional oil field. But as we start to bring these online, then so it will take 2 to 3 years before they come online. And again, it's difficult to see where anything I can think of that would come and will fill the gap. So one way or another, we're in for a very rocky time.
And let me show you another chart here that shows just kind of the nature in a snapshot here of the global problem. What you have here is Asia's onshore crude stocks, except for China, but you mentioned a minute ago, has actually foreseen this possibility and is quite big. The red and the dotted line you see there is the average from 2024 to 2025, the red line specifically being 2025. And then that blue line is current for this year. And you see the stocks are off the chart below. So at the time when ordinarily, historically, their stocks are going to have been climbing, now then they're going through the basement. And with the Strait of Hormuz, and a large portion of that comes from oil that generates out of the Strait of Hormuz, that's going to be a huge, huge problem for all economic activity in Asia. So how is this one going to affect the Asian economy, even aside from the global one, if this doesn't get really fast rectified?
Yeah, I mean it's catastrophic. It's existential. We're not talking. We're talking something which I suspect. I haven't done the maths yet, Danny, but we're talking something which is worse than the Depression, in as much as if you're suddenly taking the key means of actually producing food and energy and running a normal civilized society. How do buses work without diesel? How does your whole logistics train work? If you think about how modern logistics work, some of it's by rail, but the vast majority of it is by haulage with large trucks. So how do those work? So you're suddenly getting into a situation where it's difficult to get food around the place, where it's difficult to get essential supplies. I remember in an event I did about sort of 2018 or 2019, where I was talking about the diesel issue, and somebody came up to me from our local water company, that's on a regional basis, and said, "You're absolutely right." He said, "All of our contingency work and all the way that we keep our water systems running is using plant that is diesel based. It'll be the same for almost all the other sources." So it's existential, and Danny, what countries will need to do in those circumstances will be to really triage so that they're maintaining those critical areas of their country, which are to do with food and energy, communications, security, and the rest of it will have to do the best it can with whatever resources it can find. And if the countries don't do that, then I think we're going to be talking about significant disorder. And we may get that anyway, as we've already seen in countries such as Sri Lanka, where they started to run short of fuel, and that led to disorder. The difference this time round is that in the past, that disorder was, I think, a price problem due to the way that the fuel was priced, for example, in Sri Lanka. But this time round, if the oil isn't there, then that's existential for whichever country is in that difficult circumstance. So the countries to worry about are those countries which are heavily dependent on external energy supply. And it's at stages like this where you think to yourself, was it really such a good idea to do this in the Straits of Hormuz? And I think to myself, was it really such a good idea to get into a fight with Russia, who was the principal supplier of Europe of oil in general and diesel in particular? I think Russia used to provide 40% of Europe's oil. used to provide almost all of its gas. Now suddenly that's looking to me, I always felt it was, but it's now looking much more publicly to be a rather stupid thing to do.
And speaking of stupid, the whole war itself in this one, I mean, we can certainly spend a lot of time on the Russia-Ukraine war and how we could have had that off the decks. I was talking to a colleague earlier this afternoon, musing about how that war could have been off the table in April of 2022 if we had just not been stupid, is probably the nicest thing I could say about it. And now all the consequences that have resulted are part of that. Now, it's not we talked a little bit about fertilizer and how the food insecurity is going to start having an effect everywhere in the planting season. So it's already baked in something in the harvest season. But then there's also an issue with chip making. This is in the Foreign Policy magazine. The Hormuz hit to helium. The Iran war is choking off a critical input for chip making and AI infrastructure, which is, of course, now I just showed you that chart a second ago on Asia. A lot of what they're using off of that to make that the helium and to make their economic activity is fuel. So they're taking a double hit, the chip making for the helium, for the production of the chips, as well as the energy to get the work done. Now, this harkens back to me, and I'd like your view on this. One of the big issues during the COVID time, the global problem with that is that, so much economic activity had to stop, and especially chip making things, which then had impact on virtually every aspect of the global economy, especially in auto, anything electronics, cell phones, refrigerators, you name it, because they all use electronics. If this is also getting choked off in a double hit here, what impact is that going to have on the global economy because of the electronics?
It'll be the same sort of thing, but this is part of the ripples. So the ripples of the tsunami, that firstly they affect just sort of primary energy supply, but as they start to go into the chips, and as you say, I mean, from memory, it's Taiwan is 90% of the world's chips. It's also critically dependent on LNG, and it's a major LNG importer. So suddenly, if those chips are stopping to be made, well, you tell me what doesn't nowadays have a chip in. Probably my vacuum cleaner has a chip in. Almost everything that you can think of, the screens that you and I are using to talk to each other. But also, you can also so that will ripple off around the world. What you can also see, though, is it going even further down, is the primary materials before you even get to industrial production, Danny. So you tell me a mine that is not supported by diesel. Where do all the other sort of key materials come from? So the metals and the mining, if it's not grown, it's mined. And mining is critically dependent on diesel and other hydrocarbons. There's a very good, I've forgotten his name now, Václav Smil, who actually talks about this in mathematical detail. But he makes the point that the key things in the world which are essential to a modern industrial society and are critically dependent on oil and gas are fertilizer, concrete / cement, plastics and steel, and you tell me anything that's not made with one or other of those things or all of them. So again, it's all critically dependent on oil. So all of this is bound to suffer in a world where those things are occurring. I think the other thing, and I think it's something I mentioned last time around, but I find it very interesting, is that the more I've looked at it, it's very, very difficult to actually understand the system such as it is. And the reason, I'm sure, Danny, is that the whole system in which, with the trading system and the industrial production system, the way that things are run around the world, it wasn't designed. And it wasn't designed because actually it was a result of the market and the way that the globalization worked and the way that we were using oil and gas much more. And because of that, I think people don't really understand it. I mean, I've been working and thinking in energy for 15 years. And as I've watched this start of this sort of play out, I was clear on how it will work in terms of what would happen in the immediate energy sector. But the consequential impacts of all these things across the whole of the industrial system are likely to be profound. And as I say, I don't think anybody really knows exactly which levers to press, even if we could levers to press. I think actually last time round you asked me if the energies are what I would do, and I've had probably about a week and a half to think about it. I'm still not sure, Jermy. I'm still not sure, because I don't think anybody really understands it. We have a trading system which is designed, largely speaking, using the maritime sector. Some of the maritime sector things that are happening, I think bunker fuels have gone up by a factor of 2 or 3. But also we're reliant on nowadays just-in-time systems, which tend also to use the container systems, which has again revolutionized maritime trade. But these two are bound to be affected. So one way or another, we're in uncharted territory. And it's unlikely that even if the straits were closed tomorrow, that the uncharted territory would stop. The Evergreen, I think I might have mentioned last time round, Danny, but the Evergreen was the vessel which went across the Suez Canal. And Sal Magogliano was the person who made the point, which I thought was interesting, was that for every one day that the Evergreen blocked the canal, it took 6 days to actually get the maritime system sorted out. And the other interesting thing that I'd heard, I think again it might have been Sal, was that you remember the successful Red Sea campaign against the Houthi, where success was proclaimed, victory was proclaimed as the maritime forces of United States, Britain, and other nations departed in what looked to me like a bit of a retreat. But the fact is that we are still recovering from that in terms of where shipping is and how shipping has sort of sorted itself out. Because again, shipping is completely market dependent. So we're in a situation.
And I want to shift gears here to seeing, we're talking about once the war is over, then this unwinding period is going to start. So it's not going to be a panacea anyway. But if we don't get to that start point, we can't even begin unwinding. And I want to take a look in the remainder of the time we have here at what the United States is saying, and are we moving closer or further away from that? And I think you already know where this is heading. This is Secretary Scott Bessent. He's like saying, hey, you know what? How's about we just make it harder on anybody else to get any kind of oil at all? Doing business with sanctioned Iranian airlines risks exposure to U.S. sanctions. Foreign governments should take all actions necessary to ensure that companies in their jurisdiction do not provide services to those aircraft, including provisions of jet fuel catering, landing fees, or maintenance. Under economic fury, the U.S. Treasury will impose maximum pressure on Iran and will not hesitate to act against any third parties as well. So now this is like saying, all right, we have sanctions on the country that we're at war with, but we want to expand that. And now then this economic fury, Operation Economic Fury, we want to expand to others and try to cause more disruption. But is that helping the global situation?
No, again, the surely obvious point, well, it seems surely obvious to me, but it doesn't appear to be obvious in the White House, is that if what the consequence of that will be to take more of the liquids, the hydrocarbon liquids out of the global system, more aviation fuel out of the global system, more oil out of the global system, more LNG out of the global system. So surprise, surprise, that's going to make things worse. It doesn't matter whether it's against Iran or not. I think there's also an interesting question in that Secretary Bessent said that would not hesitate to act against third parties. Does that mean China? Does it mean India? Does it mean Pakistan? All of which are dependent. I mean, it's the contradictions within the policy are clear. Firstly, it's bound to make things worse, and secondly, it's bound to actually sour relationships with key allies, but also key players, particularly China, who could actually have a role in bringing this catastrophe to a close. And it won't matter for Russia so much because Russia is a net energy exporter, a major net energy exporter. But actually, surely what we should be looking to do is to actually bring the sanctions, the war to a close, and allow the straits to be open. And that's why I think in the situation, if I were in the Prime Minister of this country's situation, I'd be talking to France and Germany and saying we need to talk to the Iranians and see if we can get European tankers to have access through the Straits of Hormuz. And of course, that would probably not please the White House. But also, I think it would send a message, and the message is that, I'm sorry, this is existential for us because we want to keep our countries running, and we don't care if it goes against your sanctions policy. Because
you mentioned Germany. I'm going to get to that in just a second. But more important than that, than what the Treasury Secretary says, is what are we going to do militarily? And if anyone is looking at the charts that we're looking at here and just the data, that you would think they probably have substantially more than what we're showing here on this show. That would lead them to the conclusion that you just stated, that we need to get this deal off the table like yesterday. Whatever we got to do, let's get this thing back opened up. Even if you have to pretend we won or whatever, just make sure these blockades open up and to get that unwinding period began. But instead, we have this from some influential people. This is a former Admiral Howard who seems to be saying, no, man, we need to double down militarily.
The internal dynamics of Iran is they're under pressure, their money's starving off, they're not going to have energy, they can't keep the lights up. But more important than that, you have a vast military arsenal, both U.S. and Israeli, ready to go. So if they don't capitulate, they're going to start exercising additional options to bring this to a conclusion and ensure Iran never has a nuclear weapon. So that is inevitably the end state. How painful can the IRGC let it go on for the people of Iran and not pay for that?
Yeah, you talk about pay for making it painful. Forget about Iran. How about the rest of us if we make good on that? Let me just ask you, what do you think will happen if we do what the Admiral here suggests and we go back to a hot war?
I think that it's bound to make things worse for very, very similar reasons. It would not surprise me at all that if the United States goes back to hot war with Israel's support, actually if it resulted in a major correction in the international markets, major stock markets correction, all of which seem to be smoking opium as far as I can see, in as much as they're assuming that the world economy will just jump back into normality and that they'll be continuing to grow. But I also think it doesn't take us long to actually think it through. What sort of forces will be used? I mean, the only things at the moment are air and maritime forces, and we know the air forces are constrained because actually they can't operate from the bases that they'd like to. I think all 13 bases are vaguely usable, some not usable at all. Maritime forces are standing well off because they're worried about counter-battery missile attacks. But the only way that this is ever going to work is with land forces. And I don't know what the land forces are. Well, I guess they're around about sort of 50,000 US land forces in theater.
Oh no, there's probably about 12, 13,000 land forces.
Okay. Well, I mean, what are we going to do with 12 or 13,000 land forces? And I don't know how much of those are actually combat forces, as opposed to combat support and combat service.
Probably around 3,500 or so.
So you've got 3,500 Marines and soldiers. I mean, that's not going to make the hugest difference, I wouldn't have thought. And I have yet to see a campaign in history where air power won. I don't know if Admiral Howard was a carrier man. I mean, I wouldn't want to speak against him as a fellow carrier aviator, but you just have to look back through the history. Unfortunately, the aviation issue, and especially including aviation from the sea, was sort of started off with a theorist after the First World War. Doohay was the famous one, and it's a famous American who I've forgotten his name. It'll come back to me, Danny. But they believe that actually you can use air power to win every time. And when you look at the times in which it was done, the most obvious times were in the European campaigns of the Second World War against Germany. And it's by no means clear. I think the 8th Air Force was used more intelligently than the Bomber Command, the British forces, because the team who were running Bomber Command were very much against using it to suppress and to defeat the population. It it's questionable whether it was a war crime. I think it probably was. The same sort of thinking was with LeMay, I think, in
Oh yeah, he was the worst.
and then, of course, more recently, it was in Vietnam, Operation Rolling Thunder. But I think what the Admiral fundamentally misses, he misses what Clausewitz would call the understanding the nature of the war. And to understand the nature of the war, you've got to understand Iran and how the Iranian culture and the Iranian system. So critical to the Iranian culture is the Shia culture. And that goes back, I think, the Battle of Kabbalah, which I'm going to say 680 AD. It was that sort of time, which is celebrated every year. And in the Battle of Kabbalah, it was a battle in which all the Iranians were killed, but they were killed fighting for what they saw for a fight against oppression. So what that means to me is that they actually see this as a fight against oppression. They see this as a fight against an oppressive force, Israel and the United States, with the support, either tacit or otherwise, of the rest of the West, who have been interfering in their nation since 1946-1953. And I think they're seeing as well that they are able to see a country which is more and more unified, which probably would not have been the case if it hadn't been for the war. Whereas they're starting to see significant breakdowns in the political coalitions and the political sort of makeups in the United States, in Israel, but also in Europe and other Western nations. And I think the interesting thing, is that if the White House are thinking that it's fine one way or another, we'll be able to get this off the table before the midterms, they're too late.
Yeah.
So this will be happening over the midterms. So I think it'll be a catastrophic for the Republicans.
Well, and forget about the Republicans. It's for mankind and for all Americans, but almost everybody in different quarters of the globe. And it's one thing if somebody on TV, a retired admiral, is saying something, that's one thing. But everything comes down to what President Trump himself is going to do. And so to get some ideas about what he may be talking about, we showed you that True Social at the beginning here, where he said Iran has been is a country that is what was the term? Gary, if you can throw that one up there. I just went blank on the phrase that he used, President Trump, when he said Iran is basically falling apart. I can't remember the word he used. That's an indication that what are you talking about? Because nothing has happened in Iran. They haven't fallen apart. They're still in control of the Strait of Hormuz. So that's not a good sign. But let me show you one other one that's maybe a little more problematic. You mentioned the Germans just a second ago, and Friedrich Merz just went out very publicly. Oh yeah, he said that they're in a state of collapse. That's what it was. Thanks, Gary. Yeah, they haven't collapsed. Friedrich Merz went out and said what a lot of people have been thinking behind the scenes. He said out loud, and Trump responded to that. First, let me show you what the German chancellor said.
The Americans clearly have no strategy, and the problem with conflicts like this is always that you don't just have to go in, you also have to get out again. We saw that all too painfully in Afghanistan for 20 years. We saw it in Iraq. So this whole affair is, as I said, ill-considered, to say the least.
Okay, well, hard to argue with any of that. But as you see on the screen right there, Gary's sharing it with you. This is just minutes ago, by the way. He just said this while we've been on the air. The Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, thinks it's okay for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. He doesn't. He doesn't know what he's talking about. If Iran had a nuclear weapon, the whole world would be held hostage. I am doing something with Iran right now that no other nation or presidents should have done. Let's see, right now that other nations or presidents should have done long ago. No wonder Germany is doing poorly, both economically and otherwise. Number one, that's not what Friedrich Merz said. He said, you don't have a strategy. You don't even know what you're doing. But secondly, there never was a nuclear weapons. And if President Trump thinks that the Iranian side is falling apart, like he said in that first True Social, and now he says that it's all about this nuclear weapon, like he's obsessed with something that never existed, and that, according to his own words, has been obliterated and is still under rubble. So there is no danger of it in the near term. If he's basing his decisions on that mentality, what do you think the chances are that he's going to say, recognize all this economic data that we've been looking at over the last hour and say, you know what, time to pull the plug and get this deal off the street. What do you think?
I'm sad to say, I think it seems unlikely. I just wonder, firstly, who's briefing him, and secondly, if he is being briefed, whoever it is. Let's assume that they're telling him the truth or the sorts of analysis that you and I have just produced. How are things being missed? Because it's extremely concerning when you see something like that. I mean, what you're seeing, I think, is a consequence of building a narrative and then sticking to the narrative. I think when you and I first did our first podcast, well over a year and a half ago, perhaps nearly 2 years ago, I said about the Russia-Ukraine war that the Russia-Ukraine war was that the West were directing operations on the basis of a political narrative and the Russians on the basis of a military strategy. And I think it's exactly the same here. There's a political narrative which is largely speaking constructed, I suspect, by Netanyahu, but now taken over by Trump and being sort of refined, if you like. We've seen it in some of those things which say that Ukraine is falling apart, so that Iran is falling apart. There's no evidence of that, and Alistair Cook is very, very strong on that. But the problem is that when you're bound into this political narrative, and the political narrative assumes this is about nuclear weapons, notwithstanding that they've been obliterated, apparently, when you're bound into the political narrative, it makes any direction of operations almost impossible. So there's been no strategic analysis going into the campaign. I think Mertz is actually right on that. Just imagine if we had the campaign had been subjected before decision was made to go with the Powell or the Weinberger doctrine, the principles of working out was there an end state? Had all military solutions been or diplomatic solutions been exhausted, and all those intelligent things which were supposed to prevent America in particular and the West in general and involving themselves in wars that shouldn't have happened. If those had been, this would have ticked none of those boxes, I'm afraid. So I'm concerned. I mean, I'm doubly concerned because I thought probably that this probably wouldn't happen because I just couldn't see the upside in it for the United States, and I could see so many foreseeable downsides. And we're now back in the same situation. I can't see the upside of any more military action.
Well, not only is there no upside, and I'm sorry, just about out of time here, but there's one more soundbite I want to kind of wrap this up with because I think it's really poignant and it gets to that very issue there about seeing where this is heading. This is Chris Martenson, who, by the way, for just everybody's kind of heads up, is going to be on our show this Friday at 11 a.m. So I'm really excited to have him on for the first time. But here's one of his alarming conclusions to all this.
This is astonishing. Would you look at this average spot inflation, 7.9% year over year, up 373 basis points. That's 3.73% versus last month, March. Food price inflation. Here it goes. Okay. And so they wrote here, quote, "It should be obvious by now that the impact of the Iran war will take time to work its way through the global economy. Last week, we still had ships unloading barrels of oil that they had picked up in the Gulf before the conflict began. Many companies have stockpiles of critical chemicals and materials that act as a buffer to immediate price shocks. And in agriculture, the full effects of higher fertilizer costs won't be really felt until harvest."
So that's one thing I focused on. And in the last minute, just what is your view here? Because if the strait magically opens up tomorrow morning, and it won't, we're already got baked in problems even into the fall here. And if it's not open tomorrow and we do something stupid, what is waiting for us in the fall?
Yeah, I'm a great fan of Chris Martenson. I've been following his work for the best part of 10 years now, and he's a very, very good analyst. I'm not at all surprised, though, by the inflation. It's exactly what you'd expect for all the reasons that we've spent a lot of the time discussing it. The subtle issue is that the problem is that economists don't understand this, it seems to me. So the economists' reaction to food price inflation, or indeed any inflation, is to increase interest rates and therefore to hopefully in their minds suppress the inflation. But this isn't to do with the money supply, it's to do with increasing input costs. And so by increasing interest rates when people are already struggling you're likely to send the economies into deeper recessions. And by the time they realize that they shouldn't do that, we'll then be back to the very, very low interest rates that we saw after the great financial crisis. So I suspect that's how it will play out. But no, this is coming it's coming at us, and the issue now is not the depth of it, but it's really how long it lasts and how quickly we can start to escape from it, if indeed we can.
And with President Trump tweeting or true socialing out like he just did a few minutes ago, not a lot of optimism there. But we still have to hope that we don't do the worst of it, which is to reignite the war. At least until that happens, we still have some hope. We'll keep our fingers crossed. Thank you so much for coming on today, Commodore. Always a pleasure.